why is it that you are drawn to this practice? After we've been sitting, there's a sense of timelessness. And because I know that so many of us are often so busy and so pressured, I'd like us to feel that we have all the time in the world, or all the time that there is. However, I would like to start. Recently, I went to the National Ethnic Studies Conference, and they very consciously began every session by acknowledging the indigenous people of the land. And so I'd like us all for a moment to sit and think about the Ohlone people, the indigenous people who once lived here. Some of you may not know that, Market Street in San Francisco was said to be so full of salmon that the early European or Euro-American explorers said you could almost walk across the creek that was Market Street on the backs of the salmon. And so let's just think for a moment about this land as it was 300, 400, 500 years ago. And think about the people who harvested acorns, who had learned how to leach what would be poisonous, who have learned, as all our indigenous ancestors learned, by living in balance, in knowledge with the plants and animals of their areas. And as we sit here in this area, that even though it is modern, rest on the primeval land and those who for thousands and tens of thousands of years. Let's us remember the Ohlone who are still here, even though the government does not recognize them. They're still here, weaving their baskets, gathering what they need to gather, passing on their ways to their descendants. And let's, however we do it, affirmation, prayer, openness, affirm that they continue, that their ways continue, that the people continue, and that there is a way that they be integrated into the fabric of this time and us. I've had a lot this week to think about. I teach over in San Francisco at California Institute of Integral Studies, and we've had a lot of disruption. A workshop, a 4-day workshop on post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is about the intergenerational trauma of African Americans occurred. And the people who came were about 70% African American, many of them students. And we got to hear the pain and suffering that they had experienced in a curriculum that doesn't make room for the ancestors, the knowledge and wisdom of the ancestors. And while this is a story at one point about African Americans, it's a story that all of us know, because all of our ancestors have suffered. We've suffered the wounds of colonization, forced migrations, assimilation, forced assimilation. And so all of us have at one time or another lived with a legacy that has pain in it and grief. And it was pretty difficult for me. And it brought me again to this sense of, why do we meditate? And I think, there are probably as many answers to that question as there are folks in the room. Some of us meditate because this is the spirituality that we were born into. This is how we know it is to walk in awareness in the world. Some of us have come to this meditation after trying other ways, after suffering, after battles with, demons, the human demons, addictions, alcoholism, trauma, violence, all of those. Some of us have come to meditation because some doctor said, it's really good. It will lower your blood pressure. And I every day as I watch the ways that deep, profound ways of knowing the self, holding the body, moving in concert and in balance with others, get reduced to, this will lower your blood pressure. I feel a great grief for how the West sometimes just grabs pieces of things, without engaging with the deeper ways. But the question, as I sat, not only with the suffering of my students, but in the ways that trauma opened me up, and my great grief that the struggles that, I am 65, almost 66, and I left a college in 67, which is, not quite 40 years ago, but, a good 35 or so. And to see that those same issues are still the issues that we're struggling with. As I drove over today, I listened to a radio story about a park, and I don't know where it was, but the conflict between the people who want the park and the picnic tables to be for their children and safe and open, and the poor men, the homeless men who drink alcohol and come early in the day and drink and sit in the sun and want to use the park too, and how difficult it is for those two groups to be together. This story had a particular resonance because around Alcatraz and Adeline, my husband is a lawyer who works almost exclusively now with homeless people and low-income people. And there's a conflict. South Berkeley is gentrifying, and a little, very small, just triangular piece of a park, has been a place where elderly, mostly African American men are coming to hang out and sometimes drink. There's a former Panther Party woman who has been bringing them food and got the city to put up a porta potty. And the new neighbors don't like this. They want a place to walk their dogs. And they don't want a porta potty, and they don't want men who are drinking. And I think about all the conflict that there is in the world. And I know that, for all of us, we cannot be totally separate from the world. Why do we come to meditate? What is it that we're seeking? Is it for us, for our own enlightenment, our own awakening? Is it to sit, to find a refuge from the world? Or is it a way that we want to be in the world, in balance and in harmony? What does it mean for us? I found this quote from Martin Luther King, and it's about activism, and not all of us choose the path of the activist. It certainly is an honorable path, but so are the paths of scholars, so are the paths of parenting, so are the paths of just being a human being, just engaging with your struggles. King says, an individual has not started living fully until they can rise above the narrow confines of individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of humanity. Every person must decide at some point whether they will walk in light of creative altruism or in the darkness of destructive selfishness. This is the judgment. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? Now, with all due respect to Martin Luther King, he was an activist, and he took leadership in a struggle that benefited many people. And his struggle, his nonviolence, was in fact, in part, beholden to the work of Gandhi. And so we see how the ideas from one culture get translated, not appropriated, but translated to another. And the civil rights struggle, which started in part as a struggle for African Americans, became a struggle that Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos all joined in terms of their own struggles. And having been part of all those struggles, I also know how activists burned out. I also know how the wounds we had out of our own trauma, out of the violence that had been done to us, meant that sometimes we did bad things to one another. We ignored sexism, for example. Women in many of these movements were not treated well. We sometimes elaborated movements that focused on our struggle. There's been a really strong critique by Native Americans and Asian Americans and Latinos that the emphasis on African Americans sometimes left out others, as if forced migrations, as if the incarcerations of the Japanese, as if the denial of rights to the Chinese did not exist. So there were struggles both in those movements and with those movements that still have not ended. And what I know from my own body and the experience of my own body is that we have limits, that as much as we say, as much as this quote says, yes, we want to be altruistic, we want to share compassion, we want to help others. In the African American community, the comment is, lift as you climb. And I think that comment is also in all of our cultures. Many of our cultures are not so individualistic, but they are collective. And we work with each other. But if we totally give and give and give, we can empty ourselves and not be full. And if we empty ourselves, sometimes we do danger to our precious human body, and sometimes we do danger to others because we expect that what we do, everyone should and can do. And each of us is different. Each of us has a different talent, a different gift, a different way of being. And so, what is it that you are coming to meditation for? For me, I come in part to take refuge from the struggles in the world, to remember that thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, all peoples knew that our lives were not beds of roses. They were not paths of ease. You know, the Buddha is said to have seen sickness, old age, death, and a monk. And that from living in a palace, living in fact sheltered from all of these things, because at his birth it had been prophesied that he was an exceptional being who was either going to be a great spiritual teacher or a great ruler. And his parents, who were great rulers, you know what they wanted for their son. They wanted him to be a great ruler. And so they created a situation in which all that was unpleasant, all that might lead him to search for something else, was invisible. But, as in many fairy tales, you cannot shut out the difficult. And as all of our peoples know, the difficult exists, whether it is the difficulty of the lean years, when drought comes, the rains fail, and the harvest is not good, whether it is the earthquake that arises or the volcano, whether it is simply that in the household there is, there is not good feeling between co-wives. They look at each other. There's jealousy. Whether it's in the family or the community, the difficult is always present. This week, I came to meditation because I needed to remember that in the midst of all the discomfort and all the pain, that there was a place that I could take refuge. I also got to track, because I was willing to sit in awareness, in the feeling of, I just can't do this one moment more. This is too much. I'm ready to leave. I'm ready to walk out. I'm ready to scream. That feeling arises, and then as the day goes down, other feelings arise. It falls away. That our feelings rise and fall, just as our breath rises and falls. And that being able to meditate helps us to walk in the world, not running away from our discomfort, but being able to know that even this too shall pass. And that the discomfort of the body, the changes of aging, of physical ability and disability. There was a saying, I think in the 80s, as the disability rights movement arose, the temporarily able-bodied, that we may be able-bodied this minute, but it is only a temporary state. And as we're living longer and aging, we see that the issues of Alzheimer's, dementia, many of these will come up for us. And that living a good spiritual life does not protect us against this. Being a rich person, certainly Steve Jobs, with all his money, if richness could have bought a cure quickly for pancreatic cancer, he would still be alive. If being a spiritual teacher meant that you were free of the changes of the body, Ram Dass would not have had a stroke. All of us live with the potential discomforts of the body that can arise in any moment. Focusing on the breath is what will be with us till the end of our life. And as a midwife who In my 20 years, I was graced enough that there's only one baby that I delivered that didn't immediately breathe. And we do things for the baby. Some of you may have seen on TV how they slap the baby. And the reasons this is done is we don't know medically what causes a baby to take its first breath. We know it's something about change in temperature. We know that touch will stimulate breath. So instead of slapping babies nowadays, if the baby isn't breathing, you'll see the nurses in hospitals, they'll touch the baby, they'll rub its back, they'll tickle its feet, they'll talk to the baby. We're here, come on, breathe. And I didn't have to, in this case, breathe for the baby. Those small things. It was a home birth, so no nurses were there. It was just me and the mother. The father hadn't quite noticed. He was downstairs. He was getting the football because already there was a script for this baby. Already. And he was downstairs getting the football and calling people. And, mother and I were focused on the baby. And what I learned in that moment is that a being who is not breathing is not here, is not present in the world. Breath is really deeply significant. Breath is life. And so when we breathe, it really is a very precious thing that we are doing. It is a force that we are honoring that is really, really important, our breath. And coming back to the breath, like our blood, every one of us breathes the same air. Coming back to the breath in times of crisis, in times of struggle, in times of pain. Being the witness to whatever is going on is a way that is deeply healing, that enables us to be in the world. Sometimes it seems that much of what has been brought to the West in the form of Buddhism came from people who went to monasteries and began to translate the way it was of being in a monastery. And Buddhism, in the countries in which it originated, has lay paths that the lay people do. And often there's a lot more celebration. There's a lot more religiosity. There's a lot more of humanity, day-to-day ordinariness. But the precepts and the beliefs that are about how do we live in the world with all the joys and all the sorrows and all the pain, and having a way that helps us navigate those. That is the essence, at least for me, of what Buddhism is about. And I am not at all saying my preferred way is not to sit in front of you all, but to sit in a circle where we are all together. So I want to say that my path, what I honor in Buddhism, may be very different from your path. And that's fine. But for me, at the heart of this is, how do we walk in the world, honoring our body, honoring our heart? I think that when we're born as babies, there isn't any prejudice. There isn't any sense of innate superiority. We are born as social beings. We are born wanting to connect. As our human civilizations and societies evolved, we evolved as communities of sharing and caring. If in the beginning we were only about me and mine, I don't think we would have been able to elaborate civilizations. 40 and 50 and 60,000 years ago. We buried our dead with honor. We sprinkled them with red ochre, buried them in fetal positions, perhaps hoping for rebirth. We cared for our sick and injured. This is our heritage as humans. And what we know is that trauma, violence, meanness, all of these can warp our psyche. How is it? How can we overcome our trauma, open our heart, rest the mind? Part of this is what the journey of meditation is about. I began, talking, bringing you this quote about activism and altruism. Buddhism talks about joint virtues of wisdom and compassion. And I want to say that for me, altruism, giving to others, activism, must be balanced with love and respect for the self, the body, the family. That we must find paths of walking in harmony. And that meditation, coming back to this practice in which we slow down, step out, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, a 10-day sit, a 3-month sit, a retreat in a monastery. All of these are ways in which we deeply immerse in our hearts, in our spirits, in our inner knowing. And that some of us who are sitting here tonight, this is perhaps as deeply as we will go. Some of us will pursue going to a monastery, going to a 10-day silent retreat. It is what we will do. Some of us will choose one path now and another path in 10 years. But I want you to sit for a minute and just think, what is it that brings you to meditation? Who is it that inspires you to this path? If there is merit that you accrue from sitting, where does that merit go? Where do you want to direct it to? Why is it that you are drawn to this practice? Who is it that is inspiring you to do your work in the world? Whose shoulders do you stand on? Who is your inspiration?